My name is Philomena Esperanza. I am 32 years old. For 10 years, my father and uncle sat at our family dinner table and told me I was not built for the grind. They called my dream of becoming a surgeon a fantasy. They refused to sign my student loans, handing my brother a fortune instead. I was the joke. He was the golden boy. Then, 3 nights ago, the double doors of my emergency room crashed open. My brother was wheeled in, crushed and bleeding out, with my father screaming for the best doctor in the building. When I pulled back the trauma curtain and stepped under the lights, my father stopped breathing. Before I tell you what I did next, please take a second to hit like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, but only do it if you think this story earns it. While you're at it, drop your age in the comments. I love seeing who is listening out there. Now, let me take you to the floor of the Level 1 Trauma Center at Houston Memorial. It was Tuesday at 2:14 in the morning. The fluorescent lights burned with a sterile glare. The air smelled of iodine, metallic tang, and burnt rubber. I stood by Bay 4, stripping off a pair of torn latex gloves and tossing them into the biohazard bin. The shift was about to fracture wide open. The ambulance bay doors hit the wall with a sharp crack that silenced the murmuring nurses' station. Incoming. Blunt force trauma, high-speed rollover, the lead paramedic barked. He steered the front of the gurney while his partner pumped an ambu bag. Blood pressure is dropping fast. Diminished breath sounds on the right side. I stepped into the corridor. The patient was a male, late 20s. His chest was a purple, concave landscape of fractured ribs. The left side of his face was hidden behind a plastic oxygen mask and a spiderweb of lacerations. Blood soaked through the stark white of the EMS blankets, dripping a steady rhythm onto the polished linoleum. Then the voices hit me. "Where is the chief of surgery? I want the department head down here right now." The demand echoed off the tile walls, thick with the unmistakable cadence of Texas oil money. It was a baritone honed for commanding boardrooms and intimidating contractors. 2 men shoved past the triage desk, ignoring the security guard reaching for their shoulders. I recognized the heavy steps before I fully registered the faces. My father, Richard, wore a custom-tailored suit jacket over a golf shirt, his silver hair uncharacteristically ruined. Right behind him was Uncle Bo, his jaw set tight, a heavy silver Rolex flashing under the fluorescent lights as he pointed a stiff finger at a retreating charge nurse. "Do you know who we are?" Bo demanded, his voice carrying down the corridor. "That is Wyatt Esperanza on that table. You get the best doctor in this building, or I will buy this hospital and fire everyone on the floor." Wyatt, my older brother, the heir apparent to the logistics empire. I did not flinch. Years of ER triage teach you to compartmentalize panic. You assess the bleeding, you clamp the artery, you stabilize the room. The paramedics wheeled Wyatt into Trauma Bay 1. The privacy curtain swept shut. I walked over to the scrub sink, washed my hands with chlorhexidine, and snapped on a fresh pair of sterile surgical gloves. The cold snap of the latex was the only sound that mattered. Richard and Bo paced the waiting perimeter like caged bulls. Richard pulled out his phone, already dialing, presumably to threaten a hospital administrator. Bo cornered a young resident who looked visibly pale. I pushed through the glass doors of the trauma bay, stepping directly into their line of sight. My scrubs were stained from the previous patient. My ID badge caught the glare of the overhead surgical lamps. Attending trauma surgeon. Richard looked up. The phone slipped slightly from his ear. The bluster, the arrogance, the decade of condescension all vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing recognition. Bo opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His hand dropped back to his side. They stared at the daughter they had treated as a delusional joke. The niece, they said, lacked the grit for real success. I stood under the harsh surgical lights, the sole authority in a room where their money bought them nothing. "Step back behind the yellow line," I said. My voice carried no anger, only the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon about to cut. Or security will remove you from my ER. The operating theater was maintained at a precise 62 degrees. The cold is intentional. It keeps the surgical team alert and slows the patient's metabolic rate. I stepped through the pneumatic doors, my arms raised, water dripping from my elbows after a full surgical scrub. The circulating nurse backed me into a sterile gown and snapped my gloves over the cuffs. The chaotic noise of the emergency department was gone. In here, the world shrank to a 10 by 10-foot square of blinding white light and the rhythmic hiss of the mechanical ventilator. Wyatt lay on the table. The trauma team had stripped away his designer clothes, replacing them with a stark coat of orange betadine painted from his neck to his navel. Blue, sterile drapes isolated his chest, framing the jagged bruising that mapped the impact of the steering column. He was no longer the heir to the Esperanza fortune. He was not the golden boy. He was a failing biological system, and I was the mechanic. "Scalpel," I said. My scrub nurse slapped the cold steel handle of a 10-blade into my palm. I did not hesitate. I positioned the blade at the sternal notch and drew it down the midline of his chest in one fluid, heavy motion. Dark crimson welled up instantly, following the path of the steel. "Bovie," I said. I traded the scalpel for the electrocautery pen. The sharp smell of burning tissue and aerosolized blood rose into the air as I traced the incision, sealing the small vessels. The smoke plumed upward, catching the surgical lights. Sternal saw. The heavy, vibrating weight of the pneumatic saw settled into my grip. Opening a human chest is not a delicate procedure. It requires leverage, force, and an unwavering grip. I engaged the blade at the top of the breastbone. The saw ground downward. The sound is distinct, a low, guttural vibration that travels up your arms and settles in your teeth. Dust rose, bone gave way. Retractor. The scrub nurse handed me the fino-quieto rib spreader. I positioned the heavy metal blades between the divided halves of the sternum. I gripped the crank and began to turn. The mechanical ratcheting echoed in the quiet room. Click, click, click. The ribs groaned in protest, forced apart to expose the thoracic cavity. The physical exertion required to crank the steel open pulled tight across my shoulders. My muscles burned under the heavy lead apron and surgical gown. It was a brutal, grueling physical effort. And in that exact moment of physical strain, the sterile white walls of the operating room dissolved. The smell of copper and cauterized tissue faded, replaced by the scent of roasted garlic, expensive Cabernet, and the rich, sweet smoke of my father's imported cigars. I was 22 again, sitting at the sprawling oak dining table in the formal room of our River Oaks estate. The table was a heavy slab of polished wood, a monument to the family wealth. It was the place where judgments were passed and futures were funded. I remembered the feeling of the thick, cream-colored envelope in my hands. The letterhead bore the crest of a top-tier medical school. I had spent 2 years working overnight shifts as a scribe, studying until my vision blurred, fighting for the grades that would earn me a seat. I slid the letter across the polished oak toward my father. Richard picked it up. He did not read the acceptance details. He glanced at the logo, his expression flat, and tossed it back onto the table like a junk mail flyer. Uncle Bo sat to his right, swirling amber liquor in a crystal glass. Bo leaned back, his custom suit pulling tight across his chest, and let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "Philomena," Bo said, shaking his head, "medicine is a fantasy for girls who want to wear white coats on television. You are talking about a decade of debt. It is not a real investment." I looked at my father, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for the pride that a parent is supposed to feel. Richard simply sighed, cutting a piece of his steak with deliberate slowness. "Listen to your uncle," Richard said, not bothering to meet my eyes. "You have a good head on your shoulders, but you are not built for the grind. Surgery is a meat grinder. You do not have the stomach or the stamina for that kind of pressure. Stick to administration, maybe human resources. Let Wyatt handle the real stakes." I remembered looking across the table at Wyatt. He was 20 at the time, scrolling through his phone, entirely detached from the conversation. He had dropped out of his business program 2 weeks prior. Richard had celebrated the dropout, calling it an entrepreneurial pivot, and had already promised Wyatt an office on the executive floor. Wyatt smirked at me, a quick, dismissive upward tilt of his mouth, before returning to his screen. The memory shattered as the anesthesia monitor erupted. A high-pitched, rapid sequence of alarms pierced the operating room. I blinked, the River Oaks dining room vanishing, leaving only the blinding lights of Trauma Bay 1. "Pressure is tanking," the anesthesiologist called out from the head of the table. 60/30. Heart rate is climbing. He is throwing PVCs. We are losing his volume somewhere. "Suction," I ordered. The scrub nurse handed me the rigid plastic tubing. I plunged it into the open chest cavity. It was a lake of dark, pooling blood. Wyatt's lungs struggled against the mechanical breaths of the ventilator. His heart, exposed under the glaring lights, beat with a frantic, uncoordinated flutter. It was struggling to pump an empty system. "More suction. Give me a lap sponge." I packed the heavy cotton sponges into the cavity, soaking up the hemorrhage, racing to clear my field of vision. My gloves were coated in his blood. My forearms ached from the tension. I stared down into the chest of the brother who had smirked at my ambition. I looked at the fragile, failing anatomy of the golden boy. They had sat at that polished oak table and talked about the grind. They defined pressure as quarterly earnings, stock margins, and supply chain logistics. They wore custom suits, played golf on Tuesdays, and believed their checkbooks made them invincible. They told me I lacked the stamina for real stakes. I held my hands steady inside a human chest while the alarms screamed. I navigated the slippery, chaotic terrain of a ruptured thorax, my fingers tracing the slick surface of the aorta, feeling for the tear. I did not panic. I did not shake. The silence in my mind was profound. This was the real grind. This was the exact arena they swore would break me. And yet, here I was, standing in the blood they could never stomach, holding the life they could not buy. The anesthesiologist called out another dropping pressure reading. "We need to find the source, Phil. He is going to code." I pulled out a soaked sponge. A fresh wave of crimson surged upward from the lower left quadrant of the chest cavity. The spleen had ruptured, but that was secondary. The primary bleed was higher, hidden beneath the diaphragm. "I need a vascular clamp," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the alarms. "And page the blood bank. Tell them to send another 4 units of O-negative on the rapid infuser. We are going to be here a while." The scrub nurse slapped the heavy steel clamp into my waiting hand. I closed my fingers around the grips. Wyatt's heart shuddered, a visual manifestation of a system on the brink of total collapse. I locked my eyes on the pooling blood, taking a slow, controlled breath, and pushed my hands deeper into the chest. I was about to find out exactly how much my family's golden boy would cost me to fix. My hands were buried deep inside my brother's chest cavity. The blood was warm, slick, and blindingly dark. The rigid plastic suction tube struggled to keep the surgical field clear, swallowing thick crimson fluid as fast as it pooled. I traced the contour of his diaphragm, feeling blindly for the pulse of the descending aorta. There was a catastrophic tear in one of the major branches, likely the celiac artery, pumping a steady, rhythmic flood into the upper abdomen with every erratic beat of his failing heart. "Heart rate is 140 and thready," the anesthesiologist warned from the head of the table. His eyes were locked on the glowing monitors. "We are running out of volume. The rapid infuser is pushing the 6th unit of O-negative blood, but he is bleeding faster than we can replace it. "I need more overhead light directed down here," I commanded. "And get a Proline suture ready. 3-0 on a vascular needle. Move." My fingers slid against the torn vessel, fighting desperately for a secure grip. The slippery, metallic slickness of the blood felt exactly like the smooth, polished leather of the guest chairs in my father's corner office. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was 23 years old, It was a humid Tuesday afternoon. The air conditioning in Richard's executive suite hummed a low, expensive frequency, masking the noise of the Houston traffic far below. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling skyline, a glass and steel testament to the logistics empire he had built from nothing. I sat across from his sprawling mahogany desk, clutching a thin cardboard folder of student loan documents. Federal financial aid had maxed out. I needed a private guarantor for the remaining tuition of medical school. Without a cosigner, my hard-won seat in the incoming class would be revoked by Friday afternoon. Richard leaned back in his high-backed chair, tenting his fingers together. He did not open the folder I had placed before him. He looked at the paperwork as if it were a flawed quarterly earnings projection. "I am not putting my signature on $250,000 of debt, Philomena," he said. His voice was casual, devoid of any parental warmth or hesitation. "It is a terrible investment. You are asking me to underwrite a high-risk pipe dream. Half the people who start those programs wash out in the first 2 years. When you quit, that financial burden becomes my liability. I build profitable businesses. I do not fund liabilities." I tried to explain the acceptance statistics, my undergraduate honors, the letters of recommendation from department chairs. He held up a single manicured hand, silencing me instantly. "The answer is no. Learn to live within your means." 3 days later, the truth of his financial philosophy revealed itself. Wyatt posted a photograph on his social media feed. He was standing in the driveway of our estate, leaning against the hood of a brand-new, custom-lifted luxury truck. The caption publicly thanked Richard for the $150,000 seed money to launch a new technology startup. It was an application that promised to revolutionize freight tracking. This was a company with no business plan, zero projected revenue, and a chief executive officer who had just dropped out of a state university business program. Richard had happily liquidated a portion of his retirement portfolio to fund this venture, handing a small fortune to a son who used the first $10,000 to purchase a recreational vehicle. I did not cry. I left the River Oaks house that night and never asked for another favor. I took a graveyard shift working as an emergency room scribe, charting trauma codes from midnight to 8 in the morning to pay for my test prep materials and application fees. I slept in the back seat of my sedan between shifts. I ate stale cafeteria crackers. I built my entire career on cheap caffeine, pure spite, and relentless, agonizing labor. The sharp sting of that memory narrowed my focus in the operating theater. I isolated the torn artery beneath the diaphragm. The vessel was shredded, the delicate edges ragged from the brutal impact of the steering wheel. "Clamp," I ordered, holding out my right hand. The scrub tech pressed the delicate, ratcheted vascular instrument into my palm. I guided the metal jaws around the bleeding artery and squeezed the grips shut. The lethal flood of red stopped instantly. Got it. Suction the field dry, wash it out with warm saline. The pool of blood receded beneath the clear saline wash, revealing the clamped artery. Now came the true test. I had to sew a vessel the size of a drinking straw back together while the surrounding organs continued to spasm. Suture. I took the needle driver. My hands moved with a practiced mechanical rhythm. Drive the curved needle through the fragile tissue. Pull the synthetic thread. Tie the knot. Repeat the motion. Each microscopic stitch had to be perfect. One slip, one loose knot, and the arterial pressure would blow the repair wide open the second I removed the clamp. I was employing the precise fine motor skills I had honed during thousands of hours of unpaid surgical rotations. Skills I earned while my brother played corporate executive in a luxury truck bought with the financial security my father deliberately kept from me. I was stitching his life back together using the exact grit they swore I lacked. Tying off, I announced. I pushed the final knot down, securing the repair tight against the tissue. I released the vascular clamp slowly, watching the suture line with held breath. No leaks. The artery held strong. "Blood pressure is stabilizing," the anesthesiologist announced. a hint of genuine relief coloring his words. 90/50. Heart rate is dropping to 110. We are holding ground. Good work, Doc. I exhaled, a slow, controlled breath fogging the inside of my surgical mask. I looked down at the repaired tissue resting inside the open chest. I did not feel a rush of familial love. I did not feel the sudden urge to forgive the past. The man on the operating table was a complex biological puzzle I had sworn an oath to solve. He was a human being in critical distress, and I was a trained trauma surgeon. My duty ended at the cellular level. Let us pack the abdomen and prepare for temporary closure, I instructed the surgical team. We will leave his chest open with a vacuum dressing. He is too unstable for a final close tonight. We will take him back to the main operating room in 48 hours if he survives the night. The remainder of the procedure was a coordinated dance of damage control. We stabilized the shattered ribs with temporary plating, placed thick plastic chest tubes to reinflate the collapsed lung, and applied a sterile, clear, adhesive vacuum dressing over his open sternum. The physical toll of the intense surgery settled deep into my bones. My shoulders ached from holding tense postures. My eyes burned from staring into the harsh, focused beams of the surgical lamps. But my hands were remarkably steady as I stripped off my bloody outer gown and dropped it into the red, hazardous waste bin. I walked to the corner sink to scrub the betadine and sweat from my skin. The water ran icy cold over my wrists. I stared at my reflection in the small mirror above the washing station. The dark circles under my eyes were hard-earned. The title printed on my badge was earned. Every ounce of authority I carried in this building was bought and paid for with my own solitary sweat. Wyatt was alive because I was exactly who I said I would be. He survived because I ignored their mockery, walked away from their polished dining table, and became the architect of my own rescue. The circulating nurse approached, handing me a clean, pressed white lab coat. "The family is waiting in the private consultation room," she said, her tone gentle but cautious. "They have been asking the desk for updates every 10 minutes. Security is standing by in the hallway just in case they get loud again." I slipped my arms into the coat. The fabric was crisp against my tired shoulders. I clipped my identification badge to the lapel. The operating room was secure. The biological crisis was managed. Now I had to walk out of this quiet sanctuary and face the social crisis waiting beyond the double doors. I was about to walk into a room containing the two men who had actively tried to erase my potential and tell them that their precious air was clinging to life by a literal thread I had personally tied. I took one last breath of the cool, filtered air. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked down the long, quiet hospital corridor toward the waiting area, ready to deliver a reality check they could not buy their way out of. The corridor leading from the surgical wing to the surgical intensive care waiting area felt 100 miles long. I pushed through the heavy double doors, the ambient temperature shifting from the crisp chill of the operating theater to the stagnant, recycled warmth of the public hospital corridors. My white coat brushed against the walls as I walked. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the vascular repair was beginning to recede, leaving behind a dull ache in my lower spine and a persistent throb behind my eyes. I did not have the luxury of exhaustion. I had stabilized the biological crisis. Now I had to navigate the social one. The private family consultation room was located at the end of the hall. It was a windowless box designed for delivering bad news, furnished with durable synthetic upholstery, a low veneer coffee table, and a box of generic tissues. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The three occupants looked up simultaneously. My father, Richard, stood near the far wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid. Uncle Beau was seated, tapping a heavy leather shoe against the linoleum. And then there was Jessica. Wyatt had proposed to Jessica 8 months ago. She was the daughter of a prominent Dallas real estate developer, a woman who treated every social interaction as a transactional networking event. She sat on the edge of a faux leather sofa, her posture impeccably straight. Her blonde hair fell in deliberate, effortless waves over the shoulders of a silk blouse that cost more than a month of my scribe salary during medical school. Both of her hands were locked in a white-knuckled grip around a pale leather designer handbag, resting it on her lap like a shield. She did not stand when I entered. She did not ask if the man she was scheduled to marry was breathing. Her eyes darted from my face to the stained cuffs of my scrubs peeking out from beneath my lab coat, a fleeting look of distaste crossing her features. "Philomena," Jessica said, her voice a tight, high-pitched wire. "Thank goodness. You have to get us out of this room. These chairs are ruining my posture, and the air circulation in here is terrible." I tried speaking to the woman at the front desk, but she was unhelpful. "Wyatt is a premier policyholder. We need him transferred to the VIP recovery suite on the top floor immediately. The lighting down here is atrocious, and I cannot have visitors seeing him in a standard ward." I stood near the doorway. I looked at her pristine silk blouse. I thought about the 3 liters of dark blood I had just suctioned out of her fiancé's chest cavity. Before I could formulate a response to the sheer absurdity of her demand, Richard stepped forward. He did not ask about the surgery. He did not inquire if his son was in pain or if the internal bleeding had stopped. He checked the face of his silver watch and leveled a gaze at me that he usually reserved for underperforming regional managers. "All right, let us talk logistics," Richard said. His tone was brisk, clipped, and devoid of paternal anxiety. "He is stabilized. That is what the nurse outside told us. So, what is the recovery timeline? I need exact dates, Philomena." Wyatt is the lead point of contact on a new logistics contract with a refinery in Galveston. The preliminary signatures are due next week. We can push the in-person meetings, but he needs to be coherent enough to handle a video conference by Monday morning. Can you get him a private room with a secure internet connection by Sunday night? The room fell silent. Only the low hum of the hospital ventilation system dared to make a sound. I looked at the 3 of them. I let the silence stretch, expanding until it filled every corner of the sterile room. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a fraction of the outrage boiling beneath my ribs. Years of working in emergency medicine train you to evaluate an escalating situation and apply the exact amount of pressure needed to neutralize it. You assess the delusion. You apply the facts. I placed my hands in the pockets of my white coat. "Wyatt is not taking a conference call on Monday," I said, my voice maintaining an even, low register. "Wyatt is currently lying on a table in the intensive care unit. He has an endotracheal tube threaded down his throat because his right lung collapsed upon impact, and he cannot breathe on his own. His sternum is split open. I had to leave his chest cavity unstitched and sealed with a transparent vacuum dressing because his internal swelling is too severe to close. He has a patched celiac artery that will blow if his blood pressure spikes. He's being kept in a medically induced coma to prevent him from thrashing and tearing the surgical work that is currently keeping him from bleeding to death." Jessica let out a sharp, offended gasp, pulling her designer bag closer to her chest as if the clinical details were physically assaulting her. Uncle Bo stopped tapping his foot. "He is not moving to a VIP suite," I continued, holding my father's gaze. "He requires one-on-one nursing care, central line monitors, and a mechanical ventilator. He will remain in the surgical intensive care unit for at least 2 weeks. If he survives the infection risk of an open chest, and if his lung reinflates, he faces months of agonizing physical rehabilitation just to learn how to walk from a bed to a chair without losing his breath." Richard blinked. The corporate facade faltered for a fraction of a second, but his ego quickly rushed in to fill the void. He squared his shoulders, refusing to accept a reality he could not dictate with a checkbook. "You are exaggerating to make a point," Richard said, pointing a finger at the linoleum floor. "This is Houston Memorial. We are major donors to the cardiovascular wing. I know how this works. You are a senior doctor here now. You know the board members. I want you to go out to that desk, pull whatever strings you need to pull, and get my son the accommodations he deserves. Make it happen." The entitlement hung in the air, a toxic, heavy smog. Even after I had just spent 3 hours holding his son's failing organs in my hands, Richard still viewed me as an administrative tool, a low-level employee meant to facilitate the comfort of the real family members. 10 years ago, sitting at the River Oaks dining table, that demand would have crushed me. I would have felt the sting of his dismissal and internalized it as my own failure. Today, standing in my own hospital, wearing the coat I earned through relentless grit, his demand meant nothing at all. "I am not going to the front desk," I said. I pulled my hands out of my pockets and took one step toward him. The proximity forced him to look up slightly to meet my eyes. "I am the trauma surgeon who just spent the last 3 hours repairing shredded tissue so your son would not leave this hospital in a black bag. I am the one managing his sedation, his blood volume, and his ventilation. I am the doctor who just put him back together. I am not your concierge." Richard opened his mouth, but the sharp, commanding tone of my voice had stripped away his remaining bravado. He had no leverage here. He was a spectator in an arena he could not control. "You will receive updates during the standard rounding hours," I stated, turning my back on them and reaching for the door handle. "A social worker will come by shortly to discuss the visiting protocols for the intensive care unit. Do not ask my nurses to change his room again, or I will have your visitation privileges revoked entirely." I walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me with a firm, definitive click. The satisfying finality of the sound echoed down the quiet hallway. I had drawn the first ironclad line of my adult life against my family, and it held firm. I walked toward the main nurses' station, eager to distance myself from the suffocating arrogance of that consultation room. I needed to chart the surgical notes and review the final panel of post-operative blood work. The adrenaline was truly gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. As I approached the bank of computers at the central desk, a nagging inconsistency began to bother me. I sat down and logged into the secure hospital mainframe. Wyatt was 30 years old. He was supposed to be a brilliant, successful executive. He was engaged to a wealthy socialite. Yet he had wrapped a high-performance all-terrain vehicle around a concrete embankment at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The physics of the crash did not align with a simple loss of traction. The level of destruction required reckless, uninhibited speed. I clicked on the electronic medical record folder labeled with my brother's name. I scrolled past the surgical dictations and the vital sign flow sheets, searching for the preliminary laboratory results drawn by the emergency medical technicians upon his arrival. I located the file and opened the toxicology report. My eyes scanned the rows of data, searching for the anomaly. When I found the specific line item, the breath caught in my throat. The screen illuminated a truth so volatile, it threatened to dismantle everything my father had built. My brother was not just careless. He was hiding a secret that was about to turn this medical tragedy into a devastating legal nightmare. 48 hours slipped by in the measured, rhythmic cadence of the surgical intensive care unit. Time in this ward is not tracked by sunlight or circadian rhythms. It is measured in fluid input, urine output, and the slow titration of sedation medications. Wyatt remained suspended in a chemically induced twilight. He was stable, but his physiological margins were razor thin. I sat at the central nurses' station on Thursday afternoon, a half-empty cup of lukewarm green tea resting next to my keyboard. The hospital mainframe hummed a quiet, steady note. I pulled up my brother's chart to review the morning blood panels. White blood cell counts were holding steady. Kidney function was adequate. Then I clicked on the tab labeled Preliminary Toxicology. The laboratory had finally processed the comprehensive serum panels drawn the night the paramedics rolled him through the bay doors. I stared at the glowing monitor. The numbers on the screen were stark, black, and undeniable. Blood alcohol content, 0.24. I read the decimal again. In the state of Texas, the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle is 0.08. Wyatt was not just intoxicated. He was hovering near the threshold of alcohol poisoning. The physics of the crash suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. He did not lose control of a high-performance machine due to a patch of wet asphalt or a momentary lapse in judgment. He drove a 2,000-pound utility vehicle into a concrete embankment because his central nervous system was entirely compromised. But the alcohol was only the first line item. My eyes tracked further down the screen to the immunoassay results. The panel flagged positive for benzoyl-ecgonine, the primary metabolite of cocaine, along with high levels of synthetic amphetamines. The golden boy was a walking chemical hazard. I leaned back in the ergonomic mesh chair. The clinical data painted a vivid, disturbing portrait of a man spiraling out of control. My family loved to project an image of impeccable discipline. Richard built his logistics empire by preaching accountability and calculated risk. He funded Wyatt's startup under the guise of fostering generational wealth and entrepreneurial spirit. He boasted about his son at country club dinners, presenting Wyatt as a sharp, innovative chief executive. The reality was sitting in a hospital bed, hooked to a mechanical ventilator, pumped full of illicit narcotics. As an attending physician, I see substance abuse every day. I treat the broken bodies left behind by addiction and poor choices. But the legal ramifications of this specific chart were different. This was not a private struggle. This was a felony. I knew the Texas Penal Code. Operating an all-terrain vehicle on public or shared property while under the influence, resulting in serious bodily injury, was a severe offense. If he had hit another person, it would be intoxication assault. Even striking a static structure, the sheer volume of illicit substances in his bloodstream guaranteed criminal charges the moment law enforcement subpoenaed the medical records. The criminal element was only half the disaster. The financial devastation would be profound. Insurance companies employ legions of actuaries and lawyers to protect their capital. A standard high liability policy for a recreational off-road vehicle contains strict exclusionary clauses. Operating the machine while committing a felony or while vastly exceeding the legal limit of intoxication immediately voids the coverage. The provider would not pay a single dime for the wrecked vehicle. They would not cover the property damage to the concrete embankment. More importantly, they would not cover a single cent of the medical bills. My mind raced through the cascading consequences. Wyatt was looking at a $400,000 hospital bill for the first week of trauma care alone. Reconstructive chest surgery, weeks in the intensive care unit, and specialized respiratory therapy would easily push the total near $1 million. If the vehicle insurance denied the bodily injury claims, the financial burden shifted entirely to his primary health provider. But it went deeper than Wyatt. I remembered the paperwork I had seen years ago when Richard first established the tech startup for him. Richard was not just a silent investor. He was a corporate guarantor. He co-signed the business loans. He co-signed the equipment leases. He likely co-signed the insurance policies for the luxury trucks and recreational toys Wyatt paraded on social media. In the eyes of civil litigation, if a guarantor enables a negligent party, the liability travels upstream. If the state decided to seek restitution, or if the municipal district sued for the infrastructure damage, they would bypass the broke son and target the wealthy father. Richard walked into my hospital 2 days ago acting like a king demanding a larger throne. He ordered me to secure a VIP suite and expedite a recovery timeline so his heir could sign a lucrative oil contract. He thought his checkbook shielded him from the gritty, unpleasant realities of consequence. He did not realize his son had just planted a financial explosive under the foundation of the family empire. I sat in the glow of the monitor, a strange, chilling calm washing over me. For 10 years, I was the designated failure. I was the high-risk pipe dream. I was the daughter who was not built for the grind. They cast me aside to pour their resources into a hollow vessel. I reached for my computer mouse. The hospital protocol required me to finalize the clinical notes and formally sign the toxicology report, entering it into the permanent legal medical record. Once my electronic signature attached to that document, it became a discoverable piece of evidence. The state troopers investigating the crash would secure a warrant, retrieve the file, and the dominoes would begin to fall. I did not feel vindictive. I felt the profound weight of objective truth. The numbers on the screen did not care about the Esperanza legacy. They did not care about custom suits, country club memberships, or oil logistics contracts. They were undeniable, biological facts. Before I finalized the chart, a procedural detail caught my attention. The billing department required an updated insurance verification for patients remaining in the intensive care unit past 48 hours. If Wyatt's vehicle insurance was destined to be voided, the hospital would automatically default to his primary commercial health insurance to cover the mounting surgical costs. I opened a new tab on the terminal and navigated to the patient admissions portal. I typed in his medical record number. The screen loaded his intake demographics: address, emergency contacts, guarantor information. I scrolled down to the primary insurance provider section. Wyatt was supposed to have a top-tier executive health plan, the kind of premium coverage standard for a chief executive officer of a thriving technology firm. I located the policy number and clicked the verification status button. The system paused, communicating with the external clearinghouse. A red banner appeared across the top of the screen. Coverage terminated. Policy lapsed due to non-payment. I stared at the red text. The warning indicator blinked with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The toxicology report was a legal nightmare, but this red banner revealed a much deeper, more insidious truth. A successful technology founder does not let his premium health insurance lapse. A man preparing to sign a major contract with a Galveston refinery does not default on his basic medical premiums. The illusion was unraveling faster than I could process. Wyatt was not just driving drunk. He was driving uninsured, broke, and desperate. I needed to understand the scope of the deception. I closed the billing portal and pulled out my personal cell phone. I had to make a few quiet calls. I was about to find out exactly how much of the Golden Boy's life was a carefully constructed lie. The red text on the monitor blinked with a steady, unforgiving pulse. Coverage terminated. Policy lapsed due to non-payment. In the United States medical system, an unfunded patient lying in a surgical intensive care unit triggers immediate administrative alarms. The meter runs at an astonishing, relentless pace. A single unit of packed red blood cells costs hundreds of dollars. The mechanical ventilator forces air into the lungs, billing by the hour. The trauma bay activation alone carries a 5-figure base charge. My brother had consumed upwards of $100,000 in resources before I even closed his chest. With an open sternum, specialized thoracic nursing, and an impending reconstructive surgery, his final invoice would easily eclipse $500,000. Cash. That was the new reality. When a premium commercial policy drops a member, the hospital billing department turns to the individual. I needed to understand the structural failure of his life. A logistics firm negotiating a major contract does not let the chief executive drop off the health roster. I clicked away from the billing portal and opened the emergency contact registry in his intake file. Jessica was listed first. I bypassed her name. She lived in a curated bubble of brunch reservations and country club galas. The secondary contact was a corporate office number for his freight tracking company. I picked up the receiver of the desk phone and dialed the 10 digits. A sterile, automated voice answered. "We are sorry, the number you have reached has been disconnected and is no longer in service." I set the receiver down. A thriving enterprise does not disconnect its primary business line. I scanned the tertiary contact, Todd, listed as the Chief Operating Officer. I typed Todd's cellular number into my own phone and pressed call. It rang 4 times before the line clicked open. "Hello," a rough voice answered. Background noise suggested a crowded coffee shop. "This is Dr. Philomena Esperanza calling from Houston Memorial Hospital," I said, keeping my tone measured. "I am trying to reach the emergency contact for Wyatt Esperanza." A heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. "Look, I already told the bankruptcy trustee. Wyatt and I are done. The limited liability company is dissolved. If this is about the unpaid server hosting fees, you have to contact his legal representation. I have zero access to the corporate accounts." The words landed with the heavy thud of a judge striking a gavel. Bankruptcy trustee dissolved. "I am not a debt collector," I clarified. Wyatt was in a severe vehicle crash early this morning. He is in the intensive care unit on life support. The background noise of the coffee shop seemed to vanish. A long pause followed. "Oh my God," Todd whispered. "Is he going to make it?" "His condition is critical," I replied. "I am updating his intake file. His health coverage flagged as terminated. I need to know the status of his employment." My father believes Wyatt is signing a major deal with a Galveston refinery on Monday. Todd let out a bitter, joyless laugh. Galveston. That deal fell through 8 months ago. The refinery executives laughed us out of the room because Wyatt spent the prototype development funds on a luxury vacation to Cabo San Lucas. The company went under right after that. We lost everything. The investors pulled out. The office lease defaulted. Wyatt has not been a chief executive since November. Then how is he affording his current lifestyle, I asked. The custom all-terrain vehicle, the designer clothes. Credit, Todd answered, his voice thick with resentment, staggering amounts of high-interest personal debt. He took out predatory loans to keep up appearances for Jessica and your father. He begged Richard for a corporate bailout last month, claiming it was for payroll expansion. Your dad handed him a cashier's check for $80,000. Wyatt used it to pay off his underwater mortgage and buy that stupid off-road toy. He was terrified Richard would find out the truth. He has been drinking heavily, spiraling. I thanked Todd for the information and ended the call. I set the phone down on the sterile countertop. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed. The grand illusion of the Esperanza family was nothing but a fragile house of cards, held together by predatory lending and profound denial. I thought about the $150,000 Richard had gleefully handed his son 10 years ago. He called my medical degree a poor investment. He refused to underwrite my education because he built profitable businesses and did not fund liabilities. He poured his wealth into a son who treated capital like a limitless playground. Now, that exact son was lying 50 feet away from me. He possessed a voided insurance card, a felony blood alcohol level, and a shattered body. He owned nothing. He produced nothing. Meanwhile, the daughter they ridiculed was sitting at the central command desk of a premier medical facility. I owned my home. I paid off my student loans through relentless, agonizing work. I held a $250,000 surgical license. I held the scalpel that saved his life. I held the unalterable toxicology report that would send him to prison. I was the only solvent, stable entity remaining in the bloodline. The sheer, crushing irony of the situation settled over me like a heavy lead apron. Richard spent a decade cultivating a pristine corporate image, boasting about his sharp, innovative air. He thought he was raising a titan of industry. Instead, he raised a criminal liability who was about to drag the entire family into civil ruin. When the hospital billing department realized the commercial policy was dead, they would immediately flag the account as self-pay. A $500,000 invoice would be generated. Since Wyatt had no assets to seize, the collections agency would follow the paper trail straight to the guarantor of those loans, Richard. My father was about to absorb the shockwave of a detonated life. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The biological crisis was stabilized, but the financial and legal fallout was just beginning to gather momentum. I walked down the corridor toward the glass perimeter of the intensive care unit. Through the reinforced panes, I had a clear view of the adjacent private waiting area. Jessica was pacing the length of the small room. She held her cell phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her immaculate posture was gone. She looked frantic. She was digging through her designer handbag, pulling out credit cards, and staring at them with a mounting sense of panic. The financial devastation was already arriving at her doorstep. Wyatt must have linked their shared accounts to his failing credit lines. The automated fraud alerts and overdraft notifications were likely flooding her inbox at this exact moment. Watching her unravel through the soundproof glass, a specific memory surfaced. I saw her standing in her pristine silk blouse just an hour ago, demanding a luxury recovery suite for a man who could not even afford his own hospital gown. The sheer entitlement of her demands echoed a humiliation I had endured 2 years prior. Looking at her terrified face, the sterile hospital hallway faded, replaced by the suffocating heat of the Texas Hill Country and the blinding white canvas of a wedding reception tent. The glass wall separating the central nurses' station from the intensive care unit provided a soundproof window into the unraveling of a dynasty. I sat in my ergonomic chair and watched Jessica pace the length of the small, private waiting enclave. Her designer heels clicked a frantic, erratic rhythm against the polished linoleum. She had the phone pressed so hard against her ear that her knuckles were white. Just an hour ago, she had stood in the consultation room demanding luxury accommodations. Now she was desperately digging through her pale leather handbag. I watched her pull out a platinum credit card, stare at the numbers, and shove it back inside. She pulled out another, then a third. Her pristine silk blouse was beginning to wrinkle. The flawless blowout was losing its shape as she ran a trembling hand through her blonde hair. She was experiencing the sheer, unvarnished terror of a declined transaction. Wyatt must have routed their joint accounts through his failing corporate credit lines. The banks were freezing the assets. The automated fraud alerts were triggering. The financial safety net she married into was evaporating in real time. I observed her panic with the same clinical detachment I used to evaluate a trauma scan. I did not feel a trace of sympathy. Seeing her unravel over the sudden lack of capital brought a specific, crystallized memory to the surface. It was a memory of a time when her wealth seemed infinite, and she used every penny of it to ensure I knew my place. 2 years ago, the Texas Hill Country served as the backdrop for Wyatt and Jessica's wedding. The event was a masterclass in performative opulence. The venue was a sprawling, historic estate surrounded by ancient oak trees. They erected a climate-controlled white pavilion the size of a football field. There were thousands of imported white orchids cascading from the ceiling, a 12-piece classical orchestra, and a guest list curated to maximize corporate networking. I attended the wedding with my husband, Mateo. I met Mateo during my second year of residency. He is a pediatric oncology nurse. He spends his days coaxing smiles out of sick children and managing complex chemotherapy ports. He understands the brutal, unglamorous reality of modern medicine. He is grounded, steady, and entirely unimpressed by the superficial posturing of my family. When Mateo and I arrived at the reception, we navigated the sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos to find our assigned table. We walked past the front rows reserved for prominent real estate developers. We walked past the center tables occupied by Richard's oil industry colleagues. We kept walking until we reached table 42. It was the furthest table in the pavilion, tucked into a dark corner directly next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter pushed through with a tray of cleared plates, a blast of hot, humid air and the smell of industrial dish soap washed over our seats. We were grouped with distant cousins and the plus ones of junior logistics managers. It was a physical manifestation of exile. Mateo pulled out my chair, offering a warm, knowing smile that told me we would endure the evening together and leave early. I sat down and reached for the wedding program resting on my gold-rimmed charger plate. The program was bound in heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil embossing. I opened the thick pages. The first section listed the wedding party. Wyatt had selected 5 groomsmen. Beneath each of their names, Jessica had meticulously printed their professional titles: Chief Executive Officer, Vice President of Acquisitions, Managing Director of Equity. Their economic output was celebrated, printed in elegant script for 300 guests to admire. I turned the page to the section acknowledging the immediate family. My eyes tracked down the list: Richard Esperanza, Evelyn Esperanza, and finally, at the very bottom, my name, Miss Philomena Esperanza. I stared at the 4 letters of that prefix. Miss. The omission was glaring. The erasure was deliberate. I had sacrificed my 20s to the inside of a medical library. I had survived grueling 100-hour weeks on the surgical wards. I had earned my doctorate through blood, sweat, and relentless intellectual combat. In any formal setting, my title was doctor. They celebrated a 25-year-old groomsman for his junior executive title, but they stripped me of a medical doctorate because it did not fit their narrative. My achievement was an inconvenient reminder that their golden boy was not the only capable person in the bloodline. Matteo noticed the shift in my posture. He leaned over, his shoulder brushing mine, and read the program. His jaw tightened. The quiet anger in his eyes mirrored the ache in my chest. He stood up, taking my hand, and gently guided me away from the kitchen doors toward the head table during the cocktail hour. Jessica was standing near the towering 5-tier wedding cake, holding a flute of champagne and laughing with a group of bridesmaids. When she saw us approach, her smile tightened into a polite, rigid line. Matteo held up the cream-colored program. He spoke in a low, even tone, ensuring he did not cause a scene, but his words were firm. He asked why my professional title had been omitted when every other corporate title was proudly displayed. Jessica offered a light, breezy laugh that did not reach her eyes. She waved a manicured hand in the air, dismissing the heavy cardstock as if it were a minor inconvenience. "Oh, that's just a printing error," Jessica said, taking a sip of her champagne. "The stationer was so rushed this week. Besides, nobody really cares about all those academic letters at a social event. We want to keep the aesthetic elegant, not clinical." Before Matteo could respond to the sheer disrespect of her excuse, a heavy hand clamped onto my shoulder. Richard stepped between us. He smelled of aged scotch and expensive cologne. His grip on my shoulder was tight enough to bruise. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a harsh, reprimanding whisper. "Swallow your ego, Philomena," Richard hissed. "This night is about your brother and his new wife. Do not make a scene over a typo. You are acting like a spoiled child. Go back to your table and let them enjoy their celebration." I looked at my father. I looked at the woman who had intentionally erased my identity to protect her pristine aesthetic. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned around, walked back to table 42 with Matteo, and left the reception before the first course was served. The memory faded, pulling me back to the stark reality of the intensive care unit. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors anchored me to the present. I looked through the glass at Jessica, still pacing, still frantic. 2 years ago, she wanted to keep her aesthetic elegant, not clinical. Now she was trapped in the most clinical environment on Earth, relying entirely on the woman she had tried to erase. They had treated my medical degree as an embarrassment. They had banished me to the shadows near the kitchen doors. They wanted me to be nobody. I looked down at the computer monitor on the nurse's desk. The unfinalized toxicology report glowed brightly. Wyatt's blood alcohol content and narcotic levels were waiting for my electronic signature. My resolve hardened into diamond. The lingering ghost of a daughter seeking her father's approval vanished entirely. I owed zero protection to a family that engineered my marginalization. I did not owe them my medical license. I did not owe them my freedom. They built their empire on appearances, and now they were going to face the brutal, unvarnished truth. I reached for the computer mouse. I moved the cursor toward the green button labeled Finalize Chart. Once I clicked that button, the toxicology results would become permanent legal evidence. The insurance would void. The criminal liability would cement. My finger hovered over the left click button. I was ready to close the trap. Before I could apply pressure to the mouse, a sharp, distinct chime echoed through the quiet corridor. The heavy metal doors of the staff elevator slid open. The sound of heavy, measured footsteps hit the linoleum floor, moving with a synchronized, authoritative rhythm. I turned my head away from the monitor. 2 Texas state troopers stepped onto the ward. Their wide-brimmed hats cast long shadows under the fluorescent lights. The brass buckles of their utility belts gleamed. They walked past the triage desk with purposeful strides, their eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the intensive care unit waiting area. The legal fallout had arrived much faster than I anticipated. I pulled my hand away from the computer mouse and stood up, watching the uniforms approach the glass doors. The quiet sanctuary of the hospital was about to become a battleground. The heavy metal doors of the staff elevator parted with a dull chime. Footsteps hit the polished linoleum. The sound was distinct, a measured, synchronized cadence that belonged to heavy tactical boots rather than rubber-soled medical shoes. 2 Texas state troopers stepped onto the surgical ward. Their presence was a stark disruption to the sterile environment. They wore crisp khaki uniforms, starched stiff, with wide-brimmed campaign hats casting sharp shadows over their eyes. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the brass of their belt buckles and the dark matte finish of the sidearms holstered at their hips. They did not wander. They moved with the deliberate, unhurried purpose of men who possess the full backing of state law. Through the soundproof glass of the intensive care unit, I watched Jessica freeze. The credit card slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the veneer coffee table. She shrank back into the faux leather sofa, her posture collapsing inward. Richard, however, did not shrink. He turned away from the window, his eyes locking onto the approaching uniforms. For a man who spent his life engineering corporate mergers and dictating terms to subordinate executives, law enforcement represented an uncontrollable variable. He recognized the insignia immediately. The Highway Patrol investigated severe vehicular collisions, resulting in critical injury. He knew his son. He knew the erratic, reckless behavior Wyatt had been exhibiting for months. The brutal math connected in his head, draining the color from his face. Yet, his instinct was not surrender. His instinct was to dominate the threat. Richard stepped directly into the threshold of the waiting area, using his broad shoulders to physically block the entrance. He inflated his chest, adopting the exact imposing posture he utilized to intimidate uncooperative union representatives during contract negotiations. I could not hear the words through the thick glass, but I could read the hostile tilt of his chin and the sharp, chopping motions of his hands. He was demanding their purpose, attempting to establish an artificial hierarchy where his wealth outranked their badges. The lead trooper did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but unyielding, and spoke in a flat, bureaucratic rhythm. He held a clipboard. He was here for the official blood draw records, the chain of custody forms, and the initial toxicology screening from the single vehicle collision on Interstate 10. A warrant was likely pending, but they were initiating the preliminary inquiries to secure the evidence. Uncle Bo recognized the failure of Richard's intimidation tactic. He flanked the officers, playing the smooth, diplomatic operator. Bo smiled, offering his business card, clapping a hand over his own heart in a display of manufactured grief. He began speaking in low, soothing tones, undoubtedly dropping the names of local district attorneys and prominent judges they golfed with. He spun a narrative of a family in deep shock, claiming the primary physician was currently performing emergency life-saving measures and could not be disturbed under any circumstances. It was a calculated delay, a smokescreen designed to buy a few precious minutes. While Bo distracted the troopers, weaving a web of procedural excuses, Richard's eyes darted across the ward. His gaze bypassed the nursing staff, bypassed the telemetry monitors, and locked on to me, standing behind the central desk. He left Bo to handle the uniforms. He crossed the 60 feet of linoleum with rapid, heavy strides, his leather shoes striking the floor with punishing force. He ignored the yellow privacy tape on the ground. He marched behind the counter, reaching out before I could step back. His hand clamped around my upper arm. The grip was desperate, tight enough to compress the fabric of my white coat and the scrub top beneath it, biting into my skin. His palm was clammy. The usual scent of his expensive, aged cologne was overpowered by the sharp, acidic tang of pure, unadulterated fear. He did not speak. He pulled. I had the authority to resist. I could have shouted for hospital security, triggered the panic button under the desk, and caused a scene that would have drawn the troopers straight to us. But a cold, clinical curiosity overrode my indignation. I wanted to see it. I wanted to witness exactly how far the architect of my misery would go when the foundation of his empire finally cracked. I allowed him to guide me away from the desk, steering me down the short corridor, out of the line of sight of the law enforcement officers. He shoved open the door to the same windowless family consultation room we had occupied 2 days prior. He pulled me inside the synthetic, claustrophobic box and pushed the heavy wooden door shut behind us. He reached for the deadbolt and engaged it. The heavy metallic click of the lock sealed us in soundproof silence. The ambient noise of the hospital, the beeping monitors, the hum of the ventilation, the low voices of the troopers, all vanished. We were entirely isolated. I stood near the generic veneer coffee table, rubbing the spot on my arm where his fingers had dug in. I observed my father with the detached scrutiny of a physician evaluating a patient in the final stages of a terminal disease. He was unraveling in real time. The pristine silver hair was damp with sweat, clinging to his forehead. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his chest heaving as his cardiovascular system betrayed his spiking adrenaline. He reached up with a trembling hand and loosened his silk tie, pulling the knot down his collar as if the fabric were choking him. He paced the short length of the room, looking like a trapped animal measuring the dimensions of its cage. The room smelled of stale air and industrial cleaning supplies. It was a space designed to contain grief, but right now it was containing sheer panic. Richard ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound exhaustion that stripped away decades of carefully curated arrogance. He was a man who believed every problem possessed a price tag. He believed leverage was simply a matter of finding the right pressure point and applying capital until the obstacle moved. He knew the men in khaki were standing just down the hall. He knew they possessed the statutory power to seize his son, freeze his assets, and dismantle his reputation. He knew that all of his wealth, his political connections, and his corporate bluster were useless against the objective data stored in the hospital mainframe. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. He looked at the daughter he had deemed a poor investment, the woman he had told to swallow her ego and stay in the shadows. He looked at the white coat I earned while sleeping in the back of my sedan. He realized with suffocating clarity that I was the sole proprietor of the only currency that mattered right now. I held the medical chart. I held the unalterable truth. The trap was set, but he was the one locked inside it. He took a slow, jagged breath, preparing to cross a line from which our family would never return. The silence in the windowless consultation room felt heavy enough to shatter bone. The metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest sound I had heard since the rhythmic hum of the pneumatic sternal saw hours earlier. Richard released his bruising grip on my arm. He took a step back, the physical distance amplifying the suffocating proximity of his desperation. He ran a hand through his damp, ruined silver hair. The meticulously tailored suit jacket hung on his frame, no longer armor, but a wrinkled casualty of his unraveling control. He looked at me. Really looked at me. It was not the dismissive sideways glance he used at the polished oak dining table 10 years ago. It was the terrified, hyper-focused stare of a man staring down the barrel of an unmitigated disaster. "Philomena," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was stripped of its usual baritone resonance. "The state troopers outside are looking for the blood work. I saw the clipboard. They want the preliminary screening from the crash." I stood perfectly still near the generic veneer coffee table. I did not cross my arms or display defensive body language. I simply met his gaze with the unwavering, clinical detachment I reserve for terminal diagnoses. "Yes," I replied. "Standard procedure for a severe single-vehicle collision on a state highway. They are establishing the timeline and securing evidence for the impending warrant." Richard swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed convulsively. He took another step toward me, closing the distance, leaning in as if the soundproof walls were not enough to conceal the magnitude of the transgression he was about to propose. "Wyatt made a mistake," Richard whispered. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. A catastrophic miscalculation. "I know about the financial struggles. I know about the drinking. If those troopers get a blood alcohol level over the legal limit, the insurance carrier will automatically void the liability policy for the recreational vehicle." I did not offer him the satisfaction of feigning ignorance. I knew the stakes intimately. The voided policy meant the hospital would bill him directly for $500,000 in trauma care. But Richard was not a man who panicked over a hospital bill. He was a man who panicked over total structural failure. "It goes beyond the medical expenses," Richard continued, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He struck a municipal concrete embankment. The city will sue for infrastructure damage. The state will file felony intoxication assault charges due to the severity of the wreck, even without another vehicle involved. They will seize his assets. His non-existent assets, I corrected, my voice cold and precise. His technology startup is bankrupt. The commercial lease defaulted. His primary health coverage terminated 6 months ago. He is a financial ghost. Richard flinched. The confirmation that I possessed the unvarnished truth struck him harder than the physical reality of his son's shattered ribs. His jaw tightened, the muscles clenching in a desperate attempt to regain equilibrium. "You are right," Richard admitted, the confession costing him dearly. He has nothing to leverage. But I co-signed the predatory loans he took to keep the business afloat. I am the guarantor on the vehicle financing. If the state determines he committed a felony, the civil liability pierces the corporate veil and transfers directly to me. I will be personally responsible for millions of dollars in damages and legal fees. The logistics empire I built, the estate, everything will be exposed to liquidation. The magnitude of his terror was finally laid bare. He was not begging for his son's freedom. He was begging for his own preservation. He had built his kingdom on the assumption that capital could insulate him from consequence. Now the math had caught up, and the ledger was drenched in red ink. Richard reached out, his trembling hands hovering just inches from my shoulders, though he did not dare touch me again. His eyes were wide, glassy with a frantic, animalistic fear. "You are the attending physician," he said, the words rushing out in a chaotic torrent. "You control the electronic medical record. You have the administrative credentials. You need to log into the mainframe right now. Delete the toxicology results from the preliminary intake file. Erase the narcotic panel. Alter the blood alcohol content to register below the legal threshold. Sign off on a clean chart before the troopers return with the official subpoena." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the demand hung suspended in the stale, recycled air. The architect of my marginalization was not merely asking for a favor. He was issuing a direct order for me to commit medical fraud. I stared at him, the clinical detachment hardening into something far more impenetrable. I calculated the exact trajectory of his request. He was demanding that I deliberately falsify a legal document. He was commanding me to obstruct a state law enforcement investigation. He was expecting me to risk my medical license, my reputation, and a guaranteed federal prison sentence simply to shield his golden boy from a felony conviction. He wanted me to burn my entire life to the ground to keep his house warm. "You are asking me to commit a federal crime," I stated. The words were flat, devoid of inflection. Richard shook his head rapidly, his desperation overriding any semblance of logic or morality. "Nobody will know," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You are the chief of the trauma team tonight. You have the authority to override preliminary lab errors. You can cite a corrupted blood sample or a machine calibration failure. I will hire the best defense attorneys in Texas to bury the paperwork. I will compensate you, Philomena. I will pay off your student loans tomorrow. I will buy you a house. I will fund a private practice. Just alter the chart." The proposition echoed in the cramped space. a transactional bribe dripping with the same arrogance that had defined my entire childhood. 10 years ago, he refused to co-sign my educational loans because I was a poor investment. He watched me work graveyard shifts, eating vending machine crackers and sleeping in my sedan, while he handed my brother a fortune. Now, when his own empire was facing total annihilation, he suddenly found the liquidity to purchase my integrity. I looked at the man who had shaped my resilience through sheer neglect. He believed every human being possessed a price tag. He assumed that because he worshipped capital, I must worship it too. He fundamentally misunderstood the foundation of my success. I did not survive the grueling residency hours because I wanted to be rich. I survived because I wanted to be undeniable. The white coat I wore was not a status symbol. It was a testament to grit, intellectual rigor, and an unwavering commitment to the objective truth. My signature on a medical chart represented a vow to preserve human life and uphold ethical standards, regardless of the patient's surname or the father's bank account. I am not deleting the toxicology report, I said. The rejection hit him with physical force. He stumbled back a half step, his hand dropping to his side. The frantic pleading in his eyes curdled, darkening into the familiar, toxic rage he used to dominate boardrooms and silence opposition. "You do not understand the stakes," Richard hissed, his voice dropping into a menacing, guttural register. "This is not a negotiation. You will fix the chart. You are my daughter. You owe this family your loyalty. We protect our own." I did not retreat. I squared my shoulders, closing the physical distance between us, until I was standing mere inches from his chest. I did not need to raise my voice. The absolute certainty of my position was a weapon he could not counter. "You lost the right to invoke family loyalty the day you told me I was not built for the grind," I replied softly, ensuring every syllable registered with agonizing clarity. "You protected your golden boy while you let me starve. You funded his delusions while you ridiculed my ambition. Now his delusions have caught up with him, and the bill has come due." Richard's jaw clenched. The veins in his neck bulged against his loosened collar. He raised a hand, the instinct for physical intimidation surging. But he stopped. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he possessed zero leverage. I was not an employee he could terminate. I was not a competitor he could buy out. I was the sovereign authority in a kingdom he could not control. "I will destroy your career," Richard threatened, the venom dripping from his words. "I will hire a team of litigators to sue this hospital for malpractice. I will claim you were negligent in your brother's care. I will drag your name through every medical board in the state. If you let him go to prison, I will ensure you never hold a scalpel again." The threat was hollow, a desperate flail from a drowning man, but it signified a total rupture. The mask was completely off. He would willingly sacrifice my hard-earned career to mitigate his own financial ruin. Before I could deliver the final, crushing reality check, the heavy wooden door behind me rattled. The deadbolt engaged, preventing entry. Someone pounded on the exterior surface. "Richard, open the door," Uncle Beau's voice demanded from the hallway, muffled but urgent. "The troopers are getting impatient. They are calling a magistrate to expedite the warrant. We need to handle this right now." The external pressure fractured the isolated tension in the room. The law was literally knocking at the door. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the realization that the window for manipulation had officially closed. He was out of time, out of options, and entirely at my mercy. He waited for my decision, his entire empire hanging on the next words I spoke. The pounding on the heavy wooden door reverberated through the cramped space. Richard hesitated, his chest rising and falling with jagged breaths. He turned the deadbolt. Before I could step forward to exit, the door shoved inward. Uncle Beau pushed into the room, moving with surprising speed for a man in a tailored suit. Jessica followed close behind him, her face flushed and her designer handbag clutched tight against her chest. Beau reached behind his niece and pushed the door shut, twisting the lock back into place. The physical barrier was restored. I was cornered again. But now, the opposition had tripled. Beau was the designated fixer of the Esperanza dynasty. While Richard built the logistics infrastructure, his brother managed the public relations and smoothed over the inevitable corporate scandals. Beau spent his career making inconvenient truths disappear with a firm handshake and a discreet wire transfer. He thrived on the belief that any crisis could be managed if you applied the right mixture of charm and intimidation. He looked at Richard, taking in his brother's disheveled state and panicked eyes, then turned his gaze to me. Beau recognized the failure of the prior negotiation. He instantly shifted tactics, adopting the role of the reasonable mediator. "Philomena, please," Beau began, his tone dripping with practiced empathy. He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture designed to pacify. "We are all under extraordinary stress tonight. Your father is exhausted. He is terrified for his son. You have to forgive his temper. He speaks out of fear, not malice." I watched the performance without blinking. It was a flawless execution of psychological deflection. He was attempting to reframe Richard's demand for medical fraud as a symptom of paternal love. "We need to look at the bigger picture," Beau continued, stepping closer. He kept his voice low, a conspiratorial murmur. "The troopers in the hallway are building a case based on preliminary data that is often flawed. You know as well as I do that machines make errors. Blood samples get contaminated. We are not asking you to lie. We are asking you to exercise your discretionary authority as a senior physician to protect a patient from a flawed preliminary screening. Esperanzas protect their own, Philomena. That is how we survive. That is how we built everything." I stood my ground. I did not offer a nod or a verbal concession. My silence acted as a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of his rationalization back at him. I remembered the countless times I was excluded from that exact mantra. They never protected me when I was struggling to pay for textbooks or sleeping in my car. Family loyalty was a selective currency, deployed only when their own interests were threatened. When my unyielding posture made it clear that Beau's charm offensive was failing, Jessica entered the fray. Her approach was entirely different. She weaponized vulnerability. She let out a sharp, theatrical sob, her shoulders shaking beneath her pristine silk blouse. Jessica had spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless perfection. She relied on Wyatt's supposed wealth to validate her social standing in the elite circles of Dallas. The impending criminal charges and financial ruin threatened to strip away her identity. "How can you be so cold?" Jessica cried, tears spilling over her eyelashes. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the bare walls of the consultation room. "Wyatt is your flesh and blood. He is lying on a ventilator with a crushed chest, and you are acting like a robot. You are holding a grudge because you were always jealous of him. You resented the attention he received. You are using this tragedy to punish him, to punish all of us, just to prove you are better than we are." Her accusation was a masterpiece of gaslighting. She was attempting to rewrite history, portraying my adherence to medical ethics as a vindictive, petty vendetta. She wanted me to feel guilty for possessing the integrity they lacked. 2 years ago, she erased my doctorate from her wedding program to ensure I remained invisible. Now, she was accusing me of trying to steal the spotlight. I watched her tears fall, unimpressed. "You are confusing professional duty with personal vengeance," I stated. My voice remained steady, a cool contrast to her frantic sobbing. "The laboratory results are objective facts. I did not put the alcohol in his bloodstream. I did not put him behind the wheel of the vehicle. I merely ordered the test that documented his choices." My refusal to absorb her guilt sent a shockwave through the room. They were accustomed to an obedient daughter, a scapegoat who would internalize their criticism and fold under pressure. My detachment infuriated them. The rapid, suffocating pacing of the ambush accelerated. They formed a tight semicircle around me, closing the physical distance, attempting to use their combined presence to overwhelm my defenses. Richard stepped back to the forefront. The brief moment of retreat was over. his fear transmuted back into venomous, calculating hostility. The patriarch of the logistics empire would not beg a second time. "If you want to play the rigid moralist, we can play that game," Richard sneered. The veins in his forehead stood out in stark relief. He pointed a finger inches from my face. "I have a team of corporate litigators on retainer. They specialize in dismantling careers. If you finalize that toxicology report and hand my son to the state troopers, I will file a catastrophic malpractice lawsuit against you and Houston Memorial by morning. I will claim you were negligent," Richard continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I will swear you were exhausted, impaired, and made critical surgical errors. I will find expert witnesses to testify that your intervention caused unnecessary complications. I will bury you in civil litigation until your legal fees bankrupt you. I will drag your name through the medical board review process until your license is suspended. You think you hold all the cards right now. You have no idea what true ruin looks like." The threat was explicit. He was willing to destroy my hard-earned livelihood, the career I built from the ground up, just to preserve the illusion of his successful heir. He would fabricate a scandal to bury the truth. He would use the wealth he denied me for my education to fund the destruction of my future. In the corner of the small room sat a standard hospital computer terminal used by social workers to update family files. Bo walked over to the desk and woke the machine. The screen glowed, displaying the standard login portal for the electronic health record system. Bo gestured toward the keyboard. "Log in," Bo commanded, his previous diplomatic tone replaced by cold instruction. "Fix the chart. Delete the preliminary screening. You do this, and your father guarantees your future. You walk out of this room, and we bury you. The choice is yours, Philomena. Do the smart thing." They stood waiting. Richard, Bo, and Jessica formed a unified front of profound entitlement. They stared at me with expectant eyes, fully anticipating that the overwhelming weight of their combined threats would break my resolve. They thought they had trapped me in a corner where the only escape route required my signature. The air in the consultation room grew thin, heavy with the expectation of my surrender. The desktop monitor hummed. Bo stood beside it, gesturing toward the keyboard with an open palm. Richard and Jessica bracketed me, forming a physical barricade between my current position and the locked door. They breathed in synchronized anticipation, waiting for the familiar capitulation that had defined my adolescence. I ignored the desktop terminal. The keyboard was a public interface, an instrument they thought they could control by proxy. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of my white coat and withdrew my personal, hospital-issued tablet. The device was encased in durable black rubber, a tool of my trade, synced directly to my medical credentials. Pressing my thumb against the biometric scanner, the screen illuminated my face with a pale blue light. A profound shift altered the atmosphere of the consultation room the moment the tablet unlocked. Richard exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The rigid tension holding his spine straight dissolved. He rolled his shoulders back, adopting the posture of a reigning monarch reclaiming his throne. He reached up, retying the silk knot at his throat, smoothing the lapels of his ruined suit jacket. The crisis in his mind was averted. Capital and intimidation had secured the perimeter once again. Beside him, Jessica let out a fragile, trembling sigh. She wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her manicured hand, her panic subsiding into a fragile relief. Uncle Bo offered a tight, professional nod, the universal gesture of a corporate fixer acknowledging a closed deal. They believed I was navigating to the delete function. They assumed the ghost of the obedient daughter had returned to absorb the collateral damage of their golden boy. It was the exact same assumption they made the day I graduated from medical school. My university held a formal white coat ceremony to mark the transition from classroom study to clinical practice. Every student stood on stage, receiving the garment that signified their entry into the profession. Families filled the auditorium, carrying bouquets and cameras, cheering for their children. I walked across that stage alone. I looked out into the sea of proud parents and saw empty velvet seats where my family was supposed to sit. Richard had scheduled a golf tournament that weekend. Beau was in Europe. They deemed the ceremony a superficial milestone, an event not worth rearranging their lucrative schedules. I stood on that stage and slipped my arms into the pristine white fabric by myself. I learned in that precise moment that any validation I required would have to be self-generated. I forged my identity in the vacuum of their absence. Holding the tablet now, I opened the electronic health record application, the interface loaded with clinical efficiency. I navigated to the intensive care unit census, selected my brother's name, and opened his pending chart. The unfinalized toxicology report dominated the screen. Blood alcohol content 0.24. Positive for synthetic amphetamines and cocaine metabolites. The digital record system utilized by Houston Memorial is a fortress of compliance. Every keystroke is logged. Every viewed document creates an audit trail. Once a physician applies an electronic signature to a preliminary lab result, the data is encrypted and permanently locked into the mainframe. It becomes a legal artifact. It cannot be altered, redacted, or deleted by any administrator, board member, or chief of surgery. Protocol for severe vehicular trauma involving illicit substances dictates an automatic routing system. Finalizing a chart with these specific parameters generates an immediate, secure transmission directly to the local law enforcement portal and the internal hospital ethics board. I did not search for the edit function. I did not attempt to alter the decimal points. I looked up from the glowing screen. I met Richard's gaze. His eyes were calm now, expectant, reflecting the entitlement of a man who had never faced a consequence he could not buy. I tapped the green button labeled Finalize and Submit. A sharp, distinct chime emitted from the tablet speakers. A green checkmark materialized on the display, followed by a system notification confirming the successful transmission of the permanent medical record. The sound was subtle, but in the silence of the consultation room, it struck like a hammer against an anvil. Richard frowned. The casual confidence faltered. He tilted his head, attempting to decipher the electronic chime. He expected the quiet click of a deleted file, not the triumphant confirmation of a submitted document. "What did you just do?" Richard asked. The words lacked their former volume, replaced by a sudden, creeping uncertainty. I lowered the tablet, letting it rest against my side. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with the man who had spent 10 years trying to convince me I was worthless. "I signed the chart," I stated. "The report is locked. The data has just been transmitted to the State Highway Patrol database and the hospital compliance office." The oxygen vanished from the room. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Uncle Beau took a sudden, staggering step backward, his shoulder colliding with the wall. Jessica dropped her handbag onto the linoleum floor, the contents spilling out in a chaotic mess of cosmetics and platinum credit cards. She clamped both hands over her mouth, a silent scream dying in her throat. Richard turned the color of wet ash. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin stark and hollow. The realization struck him with the devastating force of a physical impact. The insurance was void. The felony was cemented. The civil liability was now an inescapable reality. The millions of dollars in damages, the predatory loans, the impending lawsuits were all officially rushing toward him. "You," Richard stammered, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. His hands opened and closed in empty air. "You ruined us." I did not raise my voice, I did not scream, and I did not cry. I delivered my final diagnosis with the icy, surgical precision I had spent a decade perfecting. "My signature," I said, the words cutting through the sterile air, "is worth $250,000 in student debt and 10 years of my life. It is not for sale to cover his mistakes." I did not wait for a rebuttal. There was nothing left to negotiate. I turned my back on the three of them, exposing myself to their shock. I reached for the heavy metal deadbolt. I twisted the lock, the mechanical click signaling the end of my captivity. I pulled the heavy wooden door open and stepped out into the brightly lit hospital corridor. The transition from the suffocating trap to the open ward was jarring. The 2 Texas state troopers were standing near the triage desk, speaking in low tones with the charge nurse. When the consultation room door opened, they stopped talking. They turned their wide-brimmed hats in my direction, their eyes locking onto me. I walked directly toward the nurse's station, my strides even and unhurried. The charge nurse, a veteran professional named Carla, looked at me with a questioning expression. She held a stack of printed intake forms. "Carla," I said, projecting my voice so the law enforcement officers could hear every word clearly, "I need to formally declare a conflict of interest regarding the patient in Trauma Bay 1. I am officially recusing myself from the care of Wyatt Esperanza, effective immediately. Please transfer the attending oversight to Dr. Aris in the Surgical Intensive Care Unit." Carla blinked, processing the sudden shift in protocol, but she nodded sharply and reached for the transfer logs. The lead trooper stepped forward. "Doctor," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "we just received the electronic notification from the mainframe. The toxicology report verified. We need to secure the physical chain of custody forms. They are waiting for you at the laboratory processing desk on the 3rd floor," I replied. "The digital chart is fully finalized and available in the law enforcement portal." The trooper touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. He turned to his partner, signaling the start of the formal arrest procedure. I stood at the desk and glanced back over my shoulder. The door to the consultation room remained wide open. Richard was frozen in the doorway, staring out at the corridor. He looked past me, his eyes fixing on the 2 armed troopers moving steadily toward the intensive care unit. He watched the physical manifestation of his ruin approach, knowing he had no capital, no leverage, and no daughter left to shield him from the impact. The nurse's station offered a panoramic view of the surgical intensive care unit. I stood beside the charge nurse, holding a ceramic mug of lukewarm black coffee, and watched the inevitable progression of consequence unfold. The 2 Texas state troopers bypassed the family waiting area entirely. They moved with procedural efficiency, approaching Trauma Bay 1. My brother lay tethered to life support, his chest rising and falling to the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. The lead trooper pulled a printed document from his clipboard. It was a legal formality, executing a warrant on an incapacitated suspect, but the mechanism of the law was unforgiving. He read the charges aloud to the quiet room: intoxication assault, reckless endangerment, operating a motor vehicle under the influence resulting in severe bodily harm. A heavy steel cuff was secured to the metal bed frame, the other end clicking shut around Wyatt's uninjured wrist. The Golden Boy was officially a ward of the state. Richard stood paralyzed in the hallway, a spectator to his own profound failure. He could not buy the trooper off. He could not intimidate the steel cuff binding his son. He possessed a checkbook, but the currency required here was accountability, a tender he had never bothered to accumulate. Behind him, Jessica emerged from the consultation room. The pristine silk blouse was hopelessly crumpled. The carefully curated blonde blowout hung limp around her shoulders. She walked slowly toward the glass partition of the intensive care bay, her eyes tracking the movements of the law enforcement officers. She looked at the handcuffs. She looked at the blinking central line monitors tracking the failing organs of her supposed ticket to high society. Then her gaze drifted downward, settling on the pale leather designer handbag clutched in her trembling fingers. The platinum credit cards inside were useless plastic rectangles. The luxury wellness resorts, the country club galas, the effortless opulence she had intended to marry into evaporated right in front of her eyes. Jessica possessed a distinct survival instinct, honed in the superficial, hyper-competitive circles of Dallas real estate. She did not cry. She did not scream or offer a display of tragic devotion. She understood the mathematics of ruin better than anyone in my family. She reached for her left hand. The heavy diamond engagement ring slid off her finger with practiced ease. She walked into the hospital room, bypassing Richard entirely, and set the jewelry on the sterile aluminum bedside table. The metallic clink was faint, but definitive. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit signs. She left the hospital and never returned. The departure of the bride signaled the beginning of the structural collapse. By sunrise, the clinical urgency of the hospital transitioned into a relentless administrative machine. The billing department at Houston Memorial operates with the precision of a hunting falcon. They received the finalized electronic chart. The voided commercial insurance policy triggered an immediate system reclassification. Wyatt was flagged as a self-pay patient. The initial invoice generated for the trauma bay activation, the blood transfusions, the complex vascular repair, and the first night of intensive care landed at a staggering figure. The accounting office dispatched a financial counselor to the ward. They did not approach me. I had formally recorded my conflict of interest. They found Richard sitting on a plastic chair in the corridor. The counselor handed him a clipboard loaded with itemized expenses and a demand for a substantial upfront deposit to continue non-emergent rehabilitative care. My father spent his entire adult life leveraging debt to project dominance. He utilized corporate loans to expand his logistics empire, shielding his personal wealth behind limited liability structures. He taught his son to do the same. But the criminal nature of Wyatt's crash pierced those corporate veils with surgical precision. The district attorney initiated preliminary asset freezes pending the vehicular investigation. The vehicle insurance carrier formally denied all claims, citing the felony toxicology report as a breach of contract. The municipality filed a civil suit for the destruction of the concrete embankment and the hazardous materials cleanup required after the wreck. Richard was cornered by his own ego. To secure a high-profile criminal defense attorney capable of managing a felony intoxication case, he needed liquid capital. To prevent the hospital from transferring his son to an underfunded county facility, he needed cash. The whispers started circulating through the Houston business district within 48 hours. Lenders grew nervous. Vendors demanded upfront payment for shipping contracts. Richard was forced to cannibalize the very logistics company he had built from nothing. He liquidated his equity shares at a fraction of their market value to appease nervous board members. When that proved insufficient to cover the mounting legal retainers and medical invoices, he turned to his personal sanctuary. The sprawling River Oaks estate, the monument to his success where he had repeatedly ridiculed my ambitions, was suddenly collateral. He signed the paperwork for an enormous second mortgage, tethering his remaining years to a suffocating financial burden, simply to keep his son out of a state penitentiary. The illusion of the untouchable Esperanza dynasty fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. The men who mocked my dedication, who called my education a poor investment, were now drowning in a sea of red ink and legal subpoenas. I observed the destruction from a distance. I did not plant the explosive. I did not light the fuse. I merely refused to smother the blast with my own career. For 10 years, they demanded I play the role of the invisible shock absorber, expecting me to cushion their reckless decisions and swallow their insults. The moment I stepped aside and allowed the truth to stand, gravity executed its natural function. The fallout was breathtaking, swift, and entirely self-inflicted. During those same months, my professional trajectory moved in the exact opposite direction. The hospital administration recognized my swift handling of the surgical crisis and my strict adherence to ethical protocols. I was invited to speak at regional trauma conferences. The chief of surgery began assigning me the most complex vascular cases. I received a promotion to the head of the trauma department, a title that came with a dedicated office, a substantial salary increase, and the unquestionable respect of my peers. I did not need to print my title on expensive cardstock for people to acknowledge my expertise. My authority was woven into the fabric of the institution. My life was a testament to the slow, agonizing grind they had scoffed at. I built a fortress of competence, brick by brick, while they constructed a mansion out of paper and arrogance. I finished my rotation, handed my trauma patients over to the day shift team, and walked out of the hospital into the humid Texas morning. I unlocked my modest, paid-off sedan. I drove home to my husband, a man who understood the value of an honest day's work. We ate breakfast on our small patio. I slept deeply, unburdened by the crushing weight of their fabricated reality. My hands were clean. My conscience was clear. But the silence from my family was a temporary condition. The financial bleeding was too severe to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, the desperation would inevitably seek a new outlet. A dynasty does not collapse quietly, and eventually the architects of this disaster would realize that the only solvent entity left in their bloodline was the daughter they threw away. 6 months passed. October arrived in Houston, breaking the relentless, suffocating summer heat. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my new office on the 7th floor of the hospital. The heavy brass nameplate mounted outside the solid oak door read, Chief of Trauma Surgery. The promotion arrived in late August, a formal recognition of the clinical precision I demonstrated during the worst crisis of my career. I now directed a department of 50 attending physicians, managed a multi-million-dollar operating budget, and dictated triage protocols for the entire surgical wing. The socioeconomic realities of my bloodline had entirely inverted. I was ascending, anchored by a decade of grueling labor and ethical discipline. My family was in freefall, burdened by the crushing gravity of their own unchecked arrogance. The silence that followed the chaotic night in the emergency room was merely a temporary condition. Lewin is a loud, messy process. It demands an audience. As the autumn leaves began to turn dry and brittle, my personal cell phone became a digital repository for their decay. Uncle Bo initiated the first contact. Bo spent his entire professional life functioning as the corporate reconnaissance scout for the Esperanza Empire. He navigated conflicts with a smooth, evasive charm, always seeking an angle to exploit. The voicemail icon appeared on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing federal grant proposals. I played the message on speakerphone. Philomena, kiddo, it has been a long time. I just wanted to check in and see how the new title is treating you. We are all very proud. Give your old uncle a ring when you have a minute. Maybe we can grab a quiet lunch at the country club. The tone was jovial, dripping with a manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. He used the diminutive nickname to reestablish a paternal dynamic that never truly existed. He was testing the perimeter, searching for a weak point in my boundaries. He wanted to ascertain if the anger had subsided enough to permit a gentle financial negotiation. I did not return the call. I pressed delete, erasing his artificial charm with a single, decisive tap. 2 weeks later, a different number registered on my caller identification. It was an institutional prefix, routed through a local physical rehabilitation facility. I let the call drop to the automated answering service. I sat at my sprawling mahogany desk, the very antithesis of the flimsy folding table I studied on during my residency, and listened to my brother speak. Wyatt had never initiated a direct conversation with me in his adult life unless it involved asking for a favor or delivering a subtle, calculated insult. The voice echoing from the small speaker was unrecognizable. It was brittle, breathless, and saturated with unfiltered terror. "Phil, it is Wyatt." A sharp intake of breath hissed through the microphone, indicating severe physical discomfort. The physical therapy is agonizing. My ribs have not fused correctly. The orthopedic specialist says I will likely walk with a cane for the rest of my life. He paused, the silence stretching out, heavy with the weight of impending doom. My defense attorney received the initial plea offer from the district attorney this morning. Because of the toxicology report, the state is pushing for a minimum of 3 years in the Huntsville Penitentiary. 3 years in a maximum security facility, Phil. I am so scared. I do not know how I am going to survive in a place like that. Then came the apology. It was a jagged, tearful confession, born of profound suffering. I am sorry about the wedding, Philomena. I am sorry we seated you near the swinging kitchen doors. I am sorry I let Jessica leave your medical doctorate off the printed programs. I was a coward. I should have stood up for you, but I liked being the center of attention. I liked being the favorite child. I ruined everything." The recording ended with the sound of a grown man weeping. Pain is an exceptional, uncompromising teacher. It strips away the superficial layers of ego and forces a brutal reckoning with objective truth. His apology was genuine, but it was a currency that could not purchase a time machine. He was facing the inescapable consequences of his own entitlement. The final transmission arrived on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. The caller identification displayed the River Oaks landline. This was the same telephone number I used to dial when I was eating stale crackers in my sedan, hoping my father might offer a sliver of parental support. I let the phone ring until the automated greeting engaged. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my office, watching the raindrops trace jagged paths across the window pane, and pressed play. The voice that emerged from the device belonged to a broken stranger. It lacked the booming, resonant bass that once commanded boardrooms and terrified junior executives. It sounded fragile, raspy, and unimaginably tired. Philomena. A long, shuddering exhale filled the speaker. "It is your father." The formal introduction highlighted the vast, unbridgeable distance between us. The logistics firm is hemorrhaging capital. The corporate board forced me to step down as chairman yesterday in order to secure an emergency line of credit, but the funds were insufficient to stop the bleeding. The legal retainers for your brother are draining my personal accounts at an astonishing rate. The second mortgage on the estate adjusted this month, and I missed the payment. He swallowed audibly, the sound broadcasting a deep, agonizing humiliation. The bank dispatched a formal notice of intent to foreclose. They are preparing to seize the property. Richard Esperanza, a man who spent his life dictating terms to the world, was finally out of leverage. I have tapped every business contact, every venture capitalist, every supposed friend in my network. Nobody will return my calls. You are the only solvent entity left in this family. He did not issue a demand. He did not threaten litigation or attempt to invoke a toxic version of loyalty. The arrogance was burned away, leaving only ash. "I need a loan," he whispered, the words costing him the last remnants of his pride. $200,000 to satisfy the bank arrears and keep the criminal defense firm working on your brother's case. I know what I said to you at that dining table. I know I failed you as a parent, but I am begging you, please do not let us lose our home. The voicemail clicked off, returning my office to a profound, echoing silence. I stared at the dark screen of my cellular device. The emotional weight of the universe seemed to compress into the small rectangle of glass and metal. I held the ultimate fate of the man who had abandoned me. I possessed the liquid capital to write a check tomorrow morning. I could clear his immediate debt, secure his estate, and purchase his eternal submission. I could watch the architect of my misery grovel at my feet. Alternatively, I could delete the message, block the number, and let the bank strip away the physical monument to his ego. The power dynamic was absolute. I was the arbiter of his survival. Yet, as I processed the gravity of his plea, I realized that true strength did not involve hiding behind a digital screen. I had to deliver my final verdict, but I would not do it over a voiceless transmission. I reached for my suit jacket draped over the back of my chair. I needed to look him in the eye one last time. Friday morning broke with a pale, overcast sky. The humidity had burned off, leaving a crisp, unforgiving clarity in the Texas air. I steered my car away from the towering glass structures of the medical district. The digital navigation system guided me away from the manicured, sprawling, gated communities of my youth. River Oaks faded in the rearview mirror, a ghost town of opulent facades and hollow legacies. My destination was a generic, beige stucco rental property located in a dense, anonymous subdivision far outside the inner loop. The visual fall from grace was staggering. I pulled to the curb and shifted the transmission into park. The driveway held a modest, leased domestic sedan, a stark replacement for the fleet of imported luxury vehicles that used to gleam under the estate floodlights. The small square of front lawn needed mowing. Dry, brown leaves choked the aluminum gutters. Richard used to employ a landscaping crew that worked 3 days a week to maintain pristine topiary gardens. Now, weeds fractured the concrete walkway leading to his front door. I stepped out of my car. I carried my purse and a single sealed white envelope. I did not wear my white coat. I wore a tailored blazer and slacks, projecting the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who owned her own life. I walked up the short path and pressed the doorbell. The chime was synthetic and shrill, a cheap plastic sound that echoed through the thin drywall. Footsteps shuffled on the other side. The deadbolt clicked. The door pulled inward. Richard stood in the threshold. The physical deterioration of the man was startling. He wore pleated slacks, but the leather belt was missing. His dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the cuffs frayed at the edges. He had not shaved in several days, leaving a rough, uneven shadow across his jawline. The deep hollows under his eyes spoke of chronic, agonizing insomnia. He looked small. The commanding aura that used to consume any room he entered had evaporated, leaving behind a frail, terrified silhouette. His eyes widened. He expected a phone call, an email from a wealth management firm, or perhaps a digital wire transfer notification. He did not anticipate my physical presence on his crumbling doorstep. "Philomena," he breathed. The word barely registered above a whisper. I did not smile. I did not offer a comforting greeting. I stepped forward, forcing him to retreat into the narrow, unlit foyer. He moved aside, a reflexive submission to the shifting power dynamic. I walked into the main living space. The interior was a tragic museum of displaced ambition. Cardboard moving boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corners of the room. The furniture he managed to salvage from the estate foreclosure did not fit the dimensions of the rental. The grand, sprawling mahogany desk from his River Oaks executive office was crammed against a cheap partition wall, stripped of its power, serving as a dumping ground for unopened mail and legal notices. The room smelled of stale coffee and profound defeat. He gestured vaguely toward a cramped sofa, offering me a seat. I remained standing. In any negotiation, taking a seat concedes a portion of your spatial dominance. I intended to hold every inch of the high ground. He rubbed his hands together, the friction producing a dry, nervous sound. He opened his mouth, drawing a deep breath, preparing to launch into the pitch. I saw the familiar gears turning in his head. He was calculating the angle, ready to recite the banking deadlines, the foreclosure parameters, the precise mathematics of his ruin. He was preparing to beg. I raised my right hand, palm facing outward. It was the exact same dismissive gesture he utilized a decade ago in his corner office when he silenced my plea for a student loan cosigner. The motion stopped him instantly. The words died in his throat. He stared at my raised hand, the memory of his own past arrogance reflecting back at him. "You left a voicemail," I said. My voice was calm, pitched in an even, conversational register. "You requested $200,000 to satisfy your mortgage arrears and fund the criminal defense retainers for your son." Richard swallowed hard. "Yes, I did. The bank is moving fast. The lawyers require a replenishment of the trust account before the preliminary hearings begin next week." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved the sealed white envelope. I held it out toward him. His eyes locked onto the paper. A sudden, desperate hunger illuminated his exhausted features. He believed the transaction was complete. He believed the scapegoat had returned to perform her designated function, sacrificing her hard-earned capital to sustain his illusion. He reached out with trembling fingers and took the envelope from my grasp. He tore the seal open. His hands were shaking so severely he nearly dropped the contents. He pulled out the folded rectangular slip of paper. He stared at the check. The silence in the beige living room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He blinked, reading the numbers again, assuming his sleep-deprived eyes were betraying him. "This is for $500, Richard whispered. The hunger in his expression curdled into a devastating, hollow confusion. I asked for $200,000. This does not even cover the interest penalty on the foreclosure notice. I know exactly what you requested, I replied, holding his gaze without a trace of pity. I ran the calculations this morning. $500 covers exactly 4 weeks of the insurance co-payments for Wyatt's outpatient physical therapy. It ensures he can afford the medical care required to learn how to walk again. It does not cover your mortgage. It does not cover the attorney fees. It does not salvage your corporate legacy. The realization struck him with physical force. He lowered the check, his shoulders slumping. The brief spark of hope extinguished, plunging him back into the freezing reality of his consequences. He looked at me, a profound, aching vulnerability exposing the ruin of his pride. "Philomena, please," he rasped. "You have the resources. You are the chief of trauma surgery. You can write the full amount without noticing the deduction. If I lose the estate, the creditors will seize the remaining logistical assets. We will have nothing." I kept my posture rigid. I was the architect of my own rescue, I stated, the words sharp and unyielding. 10 years ago, you looked across a dining table and told me I was a poor investment. You claimed I was not built for the grind. You poured every ounce of your wealth into a son who treated your capital like a limitless playground. Now, that playground is a crime scene, and the bill has arrived. You cannot ask the daughter you starved to fund the banquet you threw for someone else. He closed his eyes. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracking a slow path through the gray stubble on his cheek. It was the first time in my 32 years of existence I had ever seen my father weep. The sight did not break my heart. It merely confirmed the ledger was finally balanced. I used to believe that setting a boundary required building a fortress, I continued, my tone shifting from clinical detachment to a quiet, earnest sincerity. I thought I had to construct a brick wall to keep the toxicity out. But I learned something important in the hospital. A boundary is not a wall. It is a door. He opened his eyes, looking at me through a haze of unshed tears. "I control the lock," I said. "I dictate who turns the handle. I will never be your automated teller machine. I will never fund your lifestyle, and I will never apologize for surviving the very crucible you threw me into. If you approach me searching for a transaction, this door remains permanently bolted shut." I took a step backward, moving toward the foyer. "However," I added, letting the words settle into the quiet room, "if you ever reach a point where you want to sit at a table and speak to Dr. Philomena Esperanza, if you want to know the woman who saves lives with her own 2 hands, if you want to be a father to a daughter rather than a creditor to an asset, you have my phone number. I will answer the call." I turned my back on the stacked cardboard boxes and the ruined mahogany desk. I did not wait for a promise. I did not linger to witness his grief. The terms of our future engagement were clearly defined. The choice between his suffocating pride and a genuine relationship was now resting entirely in his hands. I opened the front door, stepping out into the crisp, clarifying Texas air, leaving him alone with the consequences he had spent a lifetime earning. Late spring in Houston arrived with a distinct, oppressive humidity. The air grew thick, settling over the city like a damp wool blanket. It was the kind of weather that forced you to slow down, to breathe deliberately. I stood on the wooden deck of my backyard, a cold bottle of sparkling water in my hand, watching the twilight bleed into a deep indigo dusk. Strings of warm yellow bulbs crisscrossed the space above the lawn, casting a golden glow over a scene that defied every metric of success my father ever valued. The air smelled of post-oak wood smoke, rendered fat, and cracked black pepper. My husband Mateo stood near a battered, black iron offset smoker. He wore a faded canvas apron over a plain white undershirt, his forearm muscles flexing as he used a pair of long steel tongs to rotate a heavy cut of brisket. He was laughing, the sound rich and unfiltered, carrying over the rhythmic hum of cicadas in the surrounding trees. He was talking to Carla, the veteran charge nurse from my trauma ward. Carla sat on a scuffed plastic cooler, holding a paper plate sagging under the weight of potato salad and baked beans. She was in the middle of recounting a chaotic shift from the previous winter, gesturing wildly with a plastic fork. To her left sat Dr. Aris, the surgical intensivist who took over my brother's case the night I recused myself. Aris was dressed in worn denim and a plain gray shirt, leaning back in a canvas camping chair, a cheap domestic beer resting on the armrest. I looked around the yard. There were 30 people scattered across the grass and the wooden deck. ER technicians, surgical residents, respiratory therapists, and pediatric oncology nurses. There were no imported white orchids cascading from the ceiling. There was no classical orchestra playing in the background. There were no custom-tailored suits, no heavy silver watches, no corporate titles printed on gold foil cardstock to validate our presence. I rested my hand on the edge of the serving station. It was a flimsy, white, plastic folding table, the kind you buy for $30 at a local hardware store. It was draped with a disposable vinyl tablecloth. I ran my fingertips over the textured plastic. The sensation immediately summoned the memory of the sprawling, polished oak dining table at the River Oaks estate. That oak monolith was the altar where my father passed judgment. It was the designated arena where my ambition was ridiculed and my brother was crowned. I thought about that oak table now. It was gone. The bank foreclosed on the property 3 months ago. The estate was liquidated, the contents auctioned off to satisfy the cascading debt of Richard's ruined empire. That heavy, imposing symbol of generational wealth was likely sitting in a consignment warehouse, stripped of its power. The cheap plastic folding table under my hand possessed infinitely more structural integrity because of the people standing around it. The individuals in my backyard did not evaluate human worth based on quarterly earnings or luxury vehicle leases. They evaluated worth based on performance under extreme duress. These were the people who stood shoulder to shoulder with me while we fought back the Grim Reaper. We shared the smell of copper, the sting of fatigue, and the quiet, solemn moments after a patient slipped away. The respect in this yard was not purchased with a corporate bailout. It was earned in blood, forged in the relentless, grueling reality of the trauma bay. This was my chosen family. This was my true Table 1. The latch on the wooden privacy fence clicked. The sharp, metallic sound cut through the ambient noise of the gathering. The hinges groaned slightly as the heavy wooden gate swung inward. The laughter near the smoker faded. Conversations tapered off, the sudden quiet rippling outward until the yard fell into a tense, expectant hush. A figure stepped out of the shadows and into the warm perimeter of the string lights. It was Wyatt. The transformation was jarring. The swaggering, arrogant chief executive who used to pose in front of luxury trucks was entirely erased. He moved with a slow, agonizing stiffness. His right hand gripped the curved handle of an aluminum medical cane. Every step required deliberate, painful calculation. The rubber tip of the cane struck the paving stones with a dull, heavy thud. He wore a loose-fitting, generic cotton pullover and faded denim jeans. As he dragged his right leg forward, the hem of his jeans shifted upward. Strapped securely above his ankle was a thick, black plastic band equipped with a blinking green indicator light. It was a state-issued electronic monitoring device. He had accepted the district attorney's plea deal. To avoid a multi-year sentence in the state penitentiary, he pleaded guilty to the felony intoxication charges, forfeiting his driver's license for a decade and accepting 5 years of strict house arrest and probation. The golden boy was literally tethered to the consequences of his choices. He stopped at the edge of the patio. He looked at the crowd of medical professionals. He recognized Carla. He recognized Dr. Aris. He knew these were the people who witnessed his lowest, most pathetic moment. The old Wyatt would have bristled, puffing out his chest to mask his vulnerability behind a wall of corporate entitlement. The man standing before me merely lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping in quiet resignation. I did not rush toward him. I did not offer a theatrical embrace or a tearful declaration of forgiveness. The damage he and my father inflicted over the past decade could not be wiped clean by a single humbling moment. Trust requires a consistent, protracted demonstration of character. I set my sparkling water on the plastic table. I walked over to a stack of spare seating resting against the side of the house. I picked up a simple aluminum lawn chair with green and white nylon webbing. I carried the chair to the edge of the patio, unfolding it with a sharp snap. I set it down on the grass, a few feet away from the main gathering, and gestured toward the seat with an open palm. Wyatt looked at the chair. He looked up at me. His eyes were clear, devoid of the narcotic haze and the toxic arrogance that used to define him. They were the tired, aching eyes of a man who had lost everything except the air in his lungs. He nodded once. It was a microscopic movement, but it carried the weight of profound gratitude. He shuffled forward, leaning heavily on the cane, and lowered himself into the cheap nylon webbing with a sharp wince. His chest was still healing. The shattered sternum would ache whenever the weather turned cold, for the rest of his life. Mateo walked over, handing him a paper plate loaded with brisket and a plastic cup of water. Wyatt accepted the food, staring down at his lap, a humbled guest in the kingdom of the sister he tried to marginalize. The low hum of conversation gradually resumed around the yard. The tension dissipated, replaced by the effortless rhythm of a community that knew how to absorb a wound and keep moving forward. I turned away from the patio and looked out into the descending night. For 10 years, the men at that oak dining table called my ambition a fantasy. They told me I lacked the stamina for the real stakes. They believed that strength was a tangible asset, something you could purchase with a corporate check or lease from a luxury dealership. They were fundamentally wrong. Strength is not a tailored suit. It is not a country club membership or a superficial title printed on heavy cardstock. Strength is the icy water running over your wrists at the scrub sink at 3 a.m. It is the ability to hold a scalpel steady while the alarms scream and the monitors flatline. It is the quiet, solitary resolve to keep studying when your own father tells you that you are destined to fail. They tried to build an empire on a foundation of lies, bailouts, and unearned entitlement. Gravity did exactly what it was designed to do. It pulled the rot down to the earth. My name is Dr. Philomena Esperanza. They told me I was not built for the grind. They were right. I was not built for the grind. I am the one who built it.
Every family has a centerpiece. Usually, it is the dining room table. It is intended to be a place of warmth, where meals are shared and children's futures are spoken into existence. But in many traditional American homes, that table can inadvertently transform into a courtroom, a place where judgments are handed down, loyalty is tested, and a child's worth is quantified. The story of Philomena Esperanza is a profound mirror held up to these very dynamics. It serves as a powerful cautionary tale and a highly effective blueprint for parenting in a culture where family pride and professional success frequently and sometimes violently collide. As parents, our greatest vulnerability is our vision for our children. Sometimes that vision blinds us to who they actually are. The most glaring lesson from the Esperanza household is the absolute peril of the golden child versus scapegoat dynamic. It is a psychological trap built on perceived potential. We see a father, Richard Esperanza, willingly pouring a massive $150,000 investment into his son Wyatt's tech logistics startup, treating him as the undeniable heir to success. In the exact same breath, he dismisses his daughter Philomena's deep-seated medical dreams as nothing more than a high-risk pipe dream, refusing to even co-sign the loans she needed to survive. When parents play favorites based on gender, blind compliance, or a narrow traditional definition of what success looks like, they are planting seeds of ruin. By constantly insulating Wyatt from the natural consequences of his actions and funding an illusion of success, his parents unwittingly paved his path toward a life of bailouts and narcotics. Conversely, their neglect forced Philomena into the fire, forging her into a fierce, independent professional out of sheer necessity. We must ask ourselves, are we providing equitable support based on a child's actual effort and passion? Or are we funding a fantasy of who we want them to be? Furthermore, we live in a society that deeply loves a good performance. In high-stakes environments, like the Texas oil industry that the Esperanzas navigated, it is alarmingly easy to mistake wealth and corporate titles for genuine character. As parents, what are we praising? Are we celebrating the designer handbags, the luxury trucks, and the flashy corporate titles? Or are we honoring the late-night studying, the resilience after failure, and the quiet, unglamorous work? The Esperanza family worshipped at the altar of appearances, willfully ignoring the visceral, bloody reality of actual, hard-won achievement. But true strength is never built on lies and bailouts. It is built in the shadows, during the lonely graveyard shifts, and the decade of relentless dedication that Philomena endured. If we want to raise resilient children, we must value their grit over their image. We must teach them that an unpolished reality is infinitely more valuable than a heavily filtered lie. It was, after all, Philomena's grueling, unseen work that made her the only person capable of saving her family when their hollow house of cards finally collapsed. Perhaps the most terrifying test of parenthood is what happens when our children make catastrophic mistakes. In traditional families, there is a fierce, almost tribal instinct to protect our own. But when does protection become corruption? The Esperanzas experienced a critical moral failure when they confused family loyalty with absolute moral compromise. When Wyatt committed a felony DUI, his family did not ask him to face justice. Instead, they demanded that Philomena commit medical fraud, risking her hard-earned license and facing a potential prison sentence, all under the toxic justification that Esperanzas protect their own. Herein lies a non-negotiable parenting value. Integrity must always supersede blind loyalty. Family love does not mean enabling self-destruction. It does not mean breaking the law or demanding that one child sacrifice their soul to cover up the sins of another. Philomena's ironclad refusal to alter her brother's medical records stands as a monument to true character. We must raise children whose professional oath and personal honor outweigh even the heaviest, most toxic demands of their family. Part of raising a child is eventually letting go of the child you raised and meeting the adult they have become. This transition from commanding authority to earning mutual respect is where many well-meaning parents falter. The Esperanza family delivered a masterclass in marginalization at a family wedding, deliberately stripping Philomena of her hard-earned doctor title, listing her merely as Miss, while ostentatiously highlighting the corporate titles of the men. They demanded she swallow her ego, demanding submission rather than celebrating her specific, incredible achievements. But respect in a healthy family must be a two-way street. When Richard tried to order his daughter to pull strings in the trauma ward, he failed miserably because he still saw an administrative assistant, completely blind to the fact that she was the absolute authority in the room. The ultimate goal of our parenting journey should be to raise an adult who is strong enough to look us in the eye and set healthy boundaries. By the narrative's end, Philomena does not build a wall of permanent resentment. She offers her father a door to a new relationship. However, that door will only open if he can speak to her with the respect owed to Dr. Philomena Esperanza. Stories like Philomena's are more than just dramatic tales. They are reflections of the quiet battles fought in living rooms and hospital waiting rooms every single day. They challenge us to look closely at our own reflections and the invisible currents shaping our homes. If this journey of family dynamics, hidden strengths, and the pursuit of truth resonates with you, I encourage you to become part of our ongoing conversation. Please follow and subscribe to the channel Sophia Told Stories, where we continue to explore the complex, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking realities of the human experience. When we eventually sit at our own metaphorical dining tables, looking across at the adults our children have become, what will we actually see? Will we see echoes of our own pride, propped up by bailouts and fragile egos? Or will we see individuals of uncompromising character who possess the strength to survive the grind and the grace to offer a hand on their own terms? The true family legacy we leave isn't forged in bank accounts or business empires. It is etched entirely into the moral compass of the people we raise. Sometimes, the most profoundly loving thing a parent can do is to step back, let the illusion shatter, and simply see who remains standing in the quiet that follows.